Recent CBS News polling finds key battleground states across the country are essentially even. And that could be because so many voters are locked in on their presidential picks from 2020. CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto, joins us now to break down the numbers. Happy Monday, Anthony. Good to see you for this Monday segment. So what is behind all of this? Which voters are planning on changing their votes nationwide, if any?
Yeah, hey, Caitlin, I wanted to show people why we might not expect wild swings in the polling this year so far, and also why this campaign could come down to just a few folks. Now, if you look at all the polling we've done over the last few months, and you look at how people, or if people are switching from their 2020 votes to 2024, take a look at this. It's just 5%. Usually I come on, I talk about big numbers, majorities. It's just that small. Now, you might say, wait a second. Well, what about independents? We always figure they're more movable. They swing more, right? Nope. If I break out just independents, it's still the same small number. It's just 6% who are switching their votes from 2020, either Biden to Trump or Trump to Biden. Now, partly this might be because it's the same two candidates. Partly this is partisans locked in. But I want to show you this example just from Pennsylvania, because even if you then ask people, OK, you're voting for Biden, you're voting for Trump, would you even consider voting for the other guy? Take a look. The numbers get even smaller. 1% of Trump voters said they would consider Joe Biden, and 2% of Biden voters saying they would consider Donald Trump. If you're a campaign, those are some of the voters you're trying to target, and it's not a lot of them, Caitlin.
Yeah, Anthony, I'm thinking about how much money has already been raised by the two campaigns and outside groups and respective committees, and trying to kind of break that down in terms of per voter cost to transfer over. That's a lot of money per voter, according to those polls, those numbers that you showed. But I'm curious kind of how this trends historically. Is there any sort of comparison, and how exactly does this impact voter turnout?
Well, let me show you this. And look, to your point, Caitlin, that's one reason that campaigns are so expensive, right? Is because campaigns are trying to target these folks, and there's not as many of them. But look, historically, if we look back at elections in the 70s and the 80s, when Reagan won in landslides, you got a quarter of Democrats voting Republican. You saw more crossover back then. But over the years and into the more recent decades from 2000, even then you got double digits. But now you're down to just 5% in 2020 who switched. Republicans were a little bit more steady in these low numbers of switching over. But even then, you're just talking about 6% who switched from Republican to voting Biden in this case in 2020. So historically, at least recently, you have been seeing lower numbers, and that is part of this partisan, hyper-partisan era that we're in, which also contributes to these small margins, Caitlin.
Yeah, becoming base elections, so to speak. Anthony Salvanto, thank you. As always, that was really interesting.
Thanks.
And let's bring in our power panel. Jasmine Wright and Daniella Diaz join us now. Jasmine is political reporter for Notice, and Daniella is a congressional reporter for Politico. Great to see you both, ladies. Thank you so much for being here. Jasmine, I want to start with you, because what Anthony was just saying there about how few, persuadable voters there are. I mean, this really feels like both camps are just trying to really rev up their base of support.
Yeah, while he was talking, I was thinking about if I was a Biden campaign staffer, that would be really good news to me, especially when we are kind of besieged with headlines that African-American voters don't like President Joe Biden. They don't want to vote for President Joe Biden, particularly men, that voters are really apathetic right now, and they don't want to put Biden necessarily in office for another term, right? So I think that works in their favor. But of course, it really still comes down to that overall question of, do you want a rematch? And a lot of these voters don't necessarily want a rematch between these two men. And I think, not just thinking about who's going to switch from Trump to Biden or Biden to Trump, one thing that Democrats are particularly worried about are the folks who stay home. Something that the vice president has said repeatedly is, losing the election to the couch. People who just don't feel involved enough in the political process, or feel like this president has done enough for their lives when it comes to the economy and other major issues, that they stay home. So I think that if you're Biden, you're probably looking at these, particularly this one in Michigan that we have in front of us, 51% for Joe Biden, 49% for Trump. Obviously a state that has come under great attention because of the response to the war in Gaza. But I think if you're looking at Biden, I mean, if you're the Biden campaign looking at these numbers, they don't look too bad. They kind of refute maybe some of the reporting that has been really dominating the past few weeks.
It's interesting to think that their biggest component could be those who don't want to show up at all. So a lot of attention paid to that. Danielle, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the Hill, which you spend so much time on. Hakeem Jeffries, of course, the Democratic leader, was on 60 Minutes last night, and he was saying that effectively Democrats have become the governing majority in Congress, given how slim the margins are. We just spoke with Tom Cole, who's the Appropriations Committee chairman, kind of about that slim margin. But I'm curious, from your perspective, reporting on Capitol Hill, I mean, is what Jeffries was saying effectively the case here?
It's complicated, Caitlin. I don't want to get too into the weeds of how things work on Capitol Hill because it's, of course, procedure.
Right.
But right now, Speaker Mike Johnson can't pass bills without Democratic help. And he has a relationship with Jeffries where he's needed Jeffries and Democrats to be able to essentially move bills across the floor, as we've seen with that huge supplemental funding package to send aid to Israel and to Ukraine and to Taiwan. And essentially, the House can't do anything without Democratic support because of that razor-thin majority that Speaker Mike Johnson has. And of course, he's got this threat of a motion to vacate this week, Caitlin, that is hanging over his head. You know, Republicans are hoping that that could just happen. Marjorie Taylor Greene triggers that. They move on. Unclear how many times she might do that. But Democrats are planning to help keep Mike Johnson as Speaker. So really, he's got a lot that he owes to Democrats and his position.
I mean, that is just, I know we are kind of used to that dynamic given such the slim margin, but that is just a fascinating dynamic to watch, that Democrats could end up saving his job. You mentioned the Israel-Hamas war, and I'm curious, Jasmine, because I know you've been covering some of the responses to these protests that we've seen on college campuses. Today, of course, Columbia announcing that they are canceling their main graduation. What has the challenge been like for the Biden administration? I mean, today, Biden spoke with Netanyahu about a potential ceasefire deal that they are so far declining, Israel is. But this seems like a persistent problem for the president.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge is so massive that it's really difficult for this White House to respond, and especially, Caitlin, to respond in a way that makes multiple people happy. I mean, if you just take President's surprise remarks last week, when talking about the protests, it felt like nobody was happy. The left wasn't happy because they felt like he didn't necessarily support protesters enough, and the right wasn't happy because, of course, he said that he would not want to call in the National Guard. So it's a tricky slope when it comes to how the president responds. I think for the president's sake himself, he has been really on the fence, touting both the commitment to the First Amendment, commitment to protest, being able to protest peacefully, but in an orderly manner. But then I think you see from the White House, Karine Jean-Pierre, press secretary, today talking about how it's a shame that just a few of those protesters ruined the commencement for Columbia students altogether. So I think you're kind of seeing some mixed messaging, but clearly they want to be somewhat involved, but not so involved that they get the blame should anything happen.
Yeah, and Danielle, I mean, it's an interesting dynamic, too, because Republican leadership on Capitol Hill, at least, certainly it seems like they are seeing an opening here politically.
And they've really seized on that opening. They're using what's happening specifically here in Washington on the GW campus, the George Washington University campus, and their protests as a messaging tool to try to reach voters, knowing that it's really riling their base. These situations with the protesters on these campuses that are for Palestine and speaking out against Israel. We saw, in fact, James Comer and the Oversight Committee go physically to the campus and really make a moment out of it just a few days ago. And we're going to continue seeing that. They continue to call out Democrats for not speaking out against this. Democrats, of course, really handling it the way that President Joe Biden is and trying to walk a fine line and kind of listen to both sides. But Republicans really seizing on this. And to say also, I mean, the number 4 Republican GOP chair Elise Stefanik, the most outspoken. And of course, she has leadership ambitions as well and is really using that to her advantage.
Yeah, and of course, everyone remembers her questioning of the university president several months ago and the fallout from those hearings. Speaking of Stefanik, because she is often talked about as a potential VP contender, I know we're 6 months away from Election Day, if you can believe it. Seems like an eternity from now. But Jasmine, I mean, we're already starting to talk about potential VP picks. Over the weekend, Donald Trump had several potential candidates to his estate in Mar-a-Lago, where they raised a lot of money. I'm curious, just covering this campaign, what you make of what this process will inevitably be like.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you said, we're already talking about it, but it's not just that we're already talking about it, it's that Trump is relishing it in us talking about it. It's a showcase. He's really putting all of these folks before his donors, before his friends, trotting them out and making them audition for this role in a lot of ways. Now, I think you can talk about who's it going to be, who's it's not going to be. Obviously, some people in the news in the last few days have made the case very hard for themselves, some better for themselves. I won't name any names. But I think...
Who could you be talking about there? Right.
But I do think that a lot of it is about personality. When I did a VP story back at CPAC, a lot of them said, we're not going to audition, but let me tell you why I would be so good for the president, why I would be a compliment to the former president. So I think it is less about regional or who can add to the ticket or who can satisfy suburban women or all those things. And personally, who could Trump govern with? Who could Trump work with?
Right. And as we can expect, it will be a performance in a lot of ways as well. Thank you so much, both of you, Daniella and Jasmine, for being with us and for your reporting. We appreciate it.